What happened? What was it that caused a normal flight with perfectly capable flight crew and a perfectly capable airplane to suddenly go into a dive and a roll where they barely were able to pull out at the last minute? What caused that?
What would cause a perfectly normal flight to rapidly deteriorate into chaos like this? Why did the flight crew's statements not coincide with what the NTSB determined? Why did the maintenance records and the subsequent investigation by the NTSB differ from what the pilot and co-pilot and the flight engineer say happened? What was going on in that cockpit that would cause them to want to hide what was going on? Why was the pertinent information for that moment of time mysteriously not present on the flight data recorder? These are the things that we're going to talk about in this video. This video is going to be a little bit more of a nerd out on some of what happened here. It's also a really fascinating little bit of a mystery that what happened that had to be unraveled during this investigation.
At the end of it all, I'd like to say that I know how long this video is going to be, but I really have no idea. I'm just kind of talking about this, seeing where it takes me. But I'm going to guess that the video is probably 12 minutes and 12 seconds long. So we'll put that at the bottom when we're done. In one of the last videos I did, we talked about the Boeing 727, and there's a portion in the video where we discussed an incident with TWA Flight A41. And that happened in 1979 over Michigan, involving a Boeing 727. We spent just a brief period of time mentioning that because the video, I could have gone off and I could have spent a whole bunch of time on that. But I started thinking about that and I was like, I could have spent a whole bunch of time just on that one incident alone. And so then I thought, well, why not? It's a fascinating incident. It's something that I've always enjoyed learning about. I remember hearing about it. I wasn't alive at the time, but I remember hearing about it when I was a kid and thinking that was a really interesting situation that happened. So why not talk about it a little bit? So I figured that's what we do today. We'll just take a few minutes and we'll talk about that. I think it's pretty interesting. Hopefully you think it's interesting as well. So in a nutshell, what happened was on April 4th, 1979, TWA Flight A41 was flying at 39,000 feet. It was a night flight, and even though below them was IFR conditions, they were in VFR conditions. Weather was not a factor. And then all of a sudden, in just barely over a minute, 63 seconds, they plunged 34,000 feet in just barely over a minute. They went ahead and they made an emergency landing in Detroit, Michigan. Everyone on board was fine. There was a few injuries as a result of the excessive G-forces, but there was no fatalities. The aircraft sustained substantial damage, but it was able to be repaired and later went back into service. So what happened? What was it that caused a normal flight with perfectly capable flight crew and a perfectly capable airplane to suddenly go into a dive and a roll where they barely were able to pull out at the last minute? What caused that? Well, we have access to the NTSB report. There was obviously an investigation after the situation, and they were able to narrow it down to the number 7 leading edge slat. What had happened was the number 7 leading edge slat had deployed fully or partially in flight. This was not supposed to happen. When this asymmetrical deployment happened, they lost control of the airplane. And really what ended up happening, the only reason they were able to regain control of the aircraft at 5,000 feet, just seconds before they hit the ground, was because that number 7 slat was actually ripped from the airplane by the G-forces. And then when that was no longer present, they were able to regain control of the airplane. During the dive and roll, they were doing whatever they could to try and regain control of the aircraft. They put up the speed brakes, but it didn't help. They deployed the landing gear, which incidentally caused extensive damage to the landing gear. But again, that also didn't help. But finally, they had punched through the clouds at 20,000 feet, and they were at 5,000 feet, which at the descent that they were diving, that was seconds from hitting the ground. And finally, they were able to regain control of the airplane. The reason being, at that point in time, that number 7 slat that had deployed had finally been ripped from the airplane. And with the asymmetry gone, they were able to regain control of the airplane, and they were able to make an emergency landing where everyone was able to deploy safely. But again, what would cause that to happen? They're cruising along, perfectly level, perfectly normal, with the autopilot on, in calm weather. All of a sudden, the number 7 slat deploys, they lose control of the airplane, everything becomes chaos, and they barely survive. Well, that's where things got interesting in the investigation, because during that period of time, the crew claimed that this was something that was completely unexpected, and that it was obviously a mechanical failure on the part of the airplane. During the investigation, though, it was determined that it's possible that there was some misalignment of that slat, but it would not have been enough to have inadvertently caused its own deployment like that. In fact, the report says the investigation disclosed no significant abnormalities or malfunctions in any of the aircraft's systems. All of the possible sources of uncommanded flight control movement were tested, and they functioned properly. The aircraft was operating within its approved performance and maneuvering envelope. But still, the crew was claiming that it was not something that they had done, but it was that it was a fault of the airplane, whether it be in design or in maintenance. But the NTSB report continues. The evidence involves a fundamental conflict between the flight crew's statements and the possibilities and probabilities of an unscheduled extension of the number 7 slat. After carefully weighing all evidence related to this incident, the safety board concludes that there is no evidence of any probable combination of failures and malfunctions in the aircraft's flight control system that would have caused an unscheduled extension of the number 7 leading edge slat. The flight crew denied having moved any controls that would have caused extension of flaps or slats. The conclusion of the safety board was, while cruising at Mach 0.816 and 39,000 feet pressure altitude with the autopilot controlling the aircraft, an attempt was made to extend 2 degrees of trailing edge flaps independently of the leading edge slats, probably in an effort to improve aircraft performance. So what ended up happening, according to the NTSB, was in all likelihood what happened was the flight crew was doing what was actually a somewhat common practice that was not official. As we discussed in that previous video, with the 727's flaps, they had a 40-degree range of flaps, but the first setting would deploy to only 2 degrees, which would effectively increase the wing area, increasing lift without increasing drag, therefore improving the efficiency of the airplane. The issue was that while you deployed the flaps, the leading edge slats would also deploy. So what would happen was the flight crew would deploy the flaps while simultaneously pulling the circuit breaker for the leading edge slats so that they would not deploy. In this situation, what probably happened was that they had done this practice, they had deployed the flaps, but for some reason the leading edge slats did deploy. Whether it was a failure to pull the circuit breaker or maybe some mechanical malfunction that caused it to go ahead and deploy anyway, the likelihood of this being what happened was very high. Of course, this not being an approved maneuver, the flight crew vehemently denied that this was what happened. However, the NTSB concluded that after many investigations, many experiments, there was no evidence to suggest that it could have been anything else. The other thing that's really interesting about this, though, was that the flight data recorder, which recorded the inputs of the airplane and the factors involved in flight, as well as the conversations of the flight crew, was, for some reason, blank during this incident. Now, the captain had the ability to go back and to erase recordings on the flight data recorder. Typically he would do this because they would land, the flight would have been uneventful, so he would go ahead and he would erase the content. But in this situation you have blank during the incident, and then the recording starts up again and goes till the end of the flight. Nobody was able to give an adequate answer as to why this may have happened. The 727 was an extremely capable tried and true airframe design. It was a proven design. The flight crew was also a capable, proven flight crew. At the time of the incident, the captain had almost 16,000 flight hours, 2,500 of which were in the 727. The first officer had 10,000 flight hours, 8,000 of which was in the 727. And the second officer had 4,000 hours, 1,200 of which were as the flight engineer for the 727. So this was a capable crew. They knew what they were doing. What you get in a situation like this, though, is a matter of perhaps this maneuver was effective, but then you combine that with the possibility of, as was mentioned earlier, there was the probability of a misaligned slat. So something that would have been fine during normal operating procedures, when you do these out-of-the-envelope procedures, suddenly everything wasn't fine anymore. This incident has gone down in history as one of those moments where everything changed because of what happened during this time. And because of that, that's something that I think is worth talking about. It's an interesting thing that happened. We were able to learn a lot from this incident, and thankfully, everyone survived. Again, we could spend so much more time on this. We could spend an hour talking about this. We could go page by page through the NTSB reports. It's got all of the information on the G loading factors and on all of the wind speeds and the gyroscopic factors and all of the numbers. And it's also fascinating information, but we're going to leave it here at this point in time. If there's something more that you'd like to talk about, some more information like this that interests you, share it in the comments below. I'd love to learn what interests you, and we'd love to talk about more things like this as well. And please subscribe to the channel. Click the bell so you get the notifications whenever we put up new videos, and this is what keeps this interesting.